It lasted only 8 seconds. 8 seconds of parliamentary voting that exposed the cruelest hypocrisy in modern British politics. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, pressed the button to cut winter fuel payments for 10 million pensioners. At precisely the same moment, her expenses records showed she'd claimed £3,700 from taxpayers to heat her own second home over the previous 5 years. 8 seconds that revealed a government willing to let pensioners freeze while keeping MPs warm at public expense. This wasn't just a policy decision. This was a moral failure that would define Labour's first year in power and destroy whatever trust remained between the political class and the people they claimed to serve. The House of Commons, Tuesday 10 September 2024. The chamber was packed with MPs, journalists in the gallery, and protesters outside chanting "Shame on Labour." Inside, the atmosphere was electric, with tension. Everyone knew this vote would be controversial, but nobody quite understood how devastating the optics would become. Rachel Reeves sat on the front bench, her face a careful mask of determination. As Chancellor, she'd announced this policy 6 weeks earlier in her emergency fiscal statement. She'd called it a tough choice, necessitated by the £22 billion black hole she claimed to have inherited from the Conservatives. Critics called it something else entirely: class warfare against the elderly. The policy was simple and brutal. Previously, every pensioner over state pension age received the winter fuel payment automatically, between £200 and £300, depending on age and household composition. It wasn't means tested. It wasn't conditioned. It was universal support to help the most vulnerable demographic pay heating bills during the coldest months. Now, under Reeves' new rules, only pensioners receiving pension credit or other means-tested benefits would qualify. The Treasury estimated this would save £1.5 billion per year. It would also strip support from 10 million pensioners, including many who were just above the pension credit threshold, but still struggling with bills. The timing made it worse. Energy prices were high following years of crisis. The energy price cap had just increased again by 10% from 1 October. Winter was approaching, and pensioners, who spend more time at home than any other demographic and often live in poorly insulated older properties, would be hit hardest. But what really ignited public fury wasn't just the policy itself, it was the hypocrisy. Because while Rachel Reeves was taking winter fuel payments away from pensioners, her own heating bills were being paid by those same pensioners through their taxes. Her expenses records, publicly available through the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, told a damning story. Between 2018 and 2023, Reeves had claimed £3,200 in energy expenses for her second home in Leeds. In 2023-24 alone, she'd claimed £1,144 for utilities. This was entirely within the rule. MPs representing constituencies outside London are allowed to claim up to £25,000 per year for accommodation costs, including rent, council tax, and utilities. The principle is straightforward. MPs need to work in both Westminster and their constituencies, so they require 2 homes. Rather than making only wealthy people able to afford being MPs, the taxpayer funds the second property. But principles don't matter when pensioners are choosing between heating and eating, and the contrast between Reeves' situation and that of the people she was cutting support from was almost obscene. Reeves earned £58,085 as Chancellor. She had a second home paid for by expenses. Her heating bills were covered, her job was secure, her pension would be generous. Meanwhile, the average state pension was £203.85 per week, roughly £10,600 per year. Many pensioners lived in homes they'd owned for decades, but couldn't afford to heat properly. Their heating bills weren't covered by anyone. Their only support had been the winter fuel payment, and Reeves had just taken it away. The vote was called. Labour MPs were whipped to support the government. This meant they'd been ordered by party managers to vote yes, on pain of losing their position, or even being expelled from the party. It's one of the ways modern parliamentary democracy works, though many would say it's one of the ways it fails. MPs don't vote based on conscience or constituency interests. They vote based on what the leadership tells them. As the division bell rang, and MPs filed through the lobbies to register their votes, something remarkable happened. 53 Labour MPs defied the whip. Some voted against the cut, others abstained, refusing to support it, but unwilling to vote against their own government. It was the biggest rebellion of Starmer's premiership so far, but it wasn't enough. With Labour's 74-seat majority, the government won easily. The final count was 348 votes for cutting winter fuel payments, 28 against. The policy would proceed. 10 million pensioners would lose their support. And then, as MPs returned to the chamber after the vote, something happened that would define the moment in public consciousness. Labour MPs cheered. They raised their fists in celebration. They applauded their own decision to take heating support away from the elderly. The images were captured by parliamentary cameras, and within minutes had spread across social media. The fury was instantaneous and overwhelming. On X, the reactions poured in. Labour MPs celebrating taking £300 from pensioners, while claiming thousands in expenses for their own heating. This is what they call tough choices. Another post showed a side-by-side comparison. An elderly woman in a coat indoors next to a photo of MPs cheering in the Commons. The caption read, "One of these people just lost their heating support. The other just claimed 3,700. Guess which is which?" Within hours, the hashtag Neighbour Hypocrisy was trending. Thousands of people were sharing the expenses records of Labour MPs who'd voted to cut pensioner support, while claiming heating costs themselves. Rachel Reeves became the focal point of the anger. Not just because she was Chancellor and had announced the policy, but because of something she'd said 6 weeks earlier that now seemed monstrously hypocritical. During her July fiscal statement, Reeves had claimed this was a decision she didn't want to make and never expected to make. She'd portrayed herself as a reluctant Chancellor, forced into tough choices by Conservative mismanagement. But her expenses records suggested a different story. Someone willing to claim taxpayer money for their own heating while taking it away from pensioners didn't look reluctant. They looked callous. The contrast between rhetoric and reality became a media-feeding frenzy. The Daily Mail ran the headline, "Reeves claims £3,700 for heating while cutting pensioners' fuel." The Telegraph calculated that some cabinet ministers had claimed over £15,000 in energy costs over 5 years. The Sun published photos of MPs' expensive London properties next to pensioners huddled in blankets. Even The Guardian, traditionally Labour-friendly, ran critical analysis pieces, questioning the political judgment of the policy. But it was the constituent letters that really revealed the human cost. In Leeds West, Reeves's own constituency, an 82-year-old woman named Margaret Thompson wrote an open letter that went viral. Mrs. Thompson had worked as a nurse for 45 years. She lived alone in a small terraced house. Her state pension, plus a modest NHS pension, gave her an annual income of £14,200, just above the pension credit threshold of She wouldn't qualify for winter fuel payments anymore. "Dear Ms. Reeves," the letter began, "you represent me in Parliament. You claimed 1,044 towels last year to heat your second home. I am about to lose £300 that helped me heat my only home. I don't have a second property. I don't have someone else paying my bills. I have arthritis and COPD. I need to keep warm to stay healthy. But you've decided that your heating matters more than mine." The letter continued with devastating simplicity. "You earn more in 2 months than I get in a year. You have a secure job and a generous pension waiting for you. I worked for 45 years, and my pension barely covers my bill. Now you're taking away one of the few bits of help I had, and then you cheered about it in Parliament. How dare you?" Mrs. Thompson's letter was read on BBC Radio 4. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media. It appeared in newspaper op-ed, and it perfectly captured what millions of people were feeling, that their government had abandoned them while looking after themselves. The government's defense of the policy only made things worse. Ministers appeared on television and radio, trying to explain that this was about targeting support to those who need it most and fixing the public finances. But every interview became a car crash when journalists asked the obvious question: why is it acceptable for MPs to claim heating expenses while cutting pensioner support? Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, who'd claimed £2,881 in energy costs in 2023-24, tried to argue that MPs' expenses were necessary to do the job, while winter fuel payments were poorly targeted universal benefits. The interviewer asked why someone earning over £90,000 needed taxpayer-funded heating. Cooper couldn't give a convincing answer. Work and Pensions Secretary Liz Kendall, responsible for implementing the cuts, went on Good Morning Britain and faced a brutal questioning from Adil Ray. "So it's okay for us to pay your expenses, but you don't have a plan to help us pay our bills?" Ray asked. Kendall tried to pivot to talking about pension credit uptake and the triple lock. Ray interrupted. "That's not an answer. Why should taxpayers fund your heating while you cut theirs?" The clip went viral. Within days, the political damage was catastrophic. Labour's poll numbers, already weak, collapsed further. A YouGov survey found that 71% of the public thought it was wrong to cut winter fuel payments while MPs could still claim heating expenses. Even 52% of Labour voters agreed. More worryingly for the government, the issue cut through in a way policy debates rarely do. It wasn't abstract economics or complex fiscal policy. It was simple moral arithmetic that anyone could understand. Politicians kept their taxpayer-funded heating while taking it away from pensioners. Rich people protected, poor people punished. Rules for thee but not for me. The pressure intensified when Age UK published research suggesting the policy could lead to 4,000 additional deaths over winter. The charity's analysis showed that many pensioners would reduce heating to save money, increasing risks of hypothermia, respiratory illnesses, and other cold-related health problems. Older people with conditions like COPD, arthritis, and heart disease need warm homes to stay healthy. Taking away their heating support could quite literally kill them. Labour MPs who'd voted for the cuts found themselves under siege in their constituencies. One MP in the northeast held a town hall meeting that descended into chaos when an 87-year-old former miner stood up and said, "I fought for workers' rights all my life. I voted Labour since 90, and now you're telling me I have to freeze while you keep claiming expenses. You're a disgrace to the movement." The MP tried to respond but was drowned out by applause and angry shouts. Several Labour MPs who'd defied the whip and voted against the cuts became local heroes. One was John Trickett, a veteran left-winger representing Hemsworth. Trickett had written to constituents explaining his vote. "I cannot in good conscience tell pensioners, in my constituency, that they must lose heating support while I continue to claim expenses for my own utilities. This is morally wrong. I will not be part of." His principled stand earned him respect even from people who'd never voted Labour. But for every MP like Trickett, there were dozens who'd followed orders and voted with the government, and now they were facing furious constituents demanding to know how they could justify the hypocrisy. The crisis deepened when investigative journalists began publishing detailed breakdowns of individual MPs' expenses. The Open Democracy investigation was particularly damaging. It revealed that between April 2017 and September 2024, MPs had claimed over £1 million in energy expenses for their second homes. Some of the highest claimants included Liam Byrne, Labour, £17,000 over 5 years. Simon Haar, Conservative, £15,800. Ben Wallace, Conservative, £9,700. Matt Hancock, Conservative, £12,700. But it was the Labour cabinet members who faced the most scrutiny, because they were the ones cutting pensioner support while claiming thousands. The analysis showed that in 2023-24 alone, 13 cabinet members had claimed over £15,000 in energy costs between them. The public anger wasn't partisan. This wasn't about Labour versus Conservative. It was about the political class versus everyone else. Both parties had MPs claiming heating expenses. Both had supported cuts to public services, while protecting their own perks. The system itself was exposed as fundamentally unfair. But Labour bore the brunt of the fury, because they were in power and had just made the decision to cut pensioner support. They were the ones who could have chosen differently, and they hadn't. Within Parliament, the atmosphere became toxic. Opposition MPs hammered the government at every Prime Minister's questions. Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, devoted her opening question to the issue. The Chancellor claims £3,700 for heating her second home, while cutting winter fuel payments for 10 million pensioners. Does the Prime Minister think this is fair? Starmer's response was legalistic and tone-deaf. The winter fuel payment was poorly targeted. We're ensuring support goes to those who need it most through pension credit, and MPs' expenses are set independently by IPSA within rules established to ensure people from all backgrounds can serve in Parliament. The answer satisfied nobody. It sounded like exactly what it was, a politician defending an indefensible position with procedural technicalities. The questions continued, each one more pointed than the last. Will the Prime Minister commit to Labour MPs giving up heating expense claims until winter fuel payments are restored? Starmer refused. How can the government justify taking £300 from an 82-year-old pensioner while the Chancellor claims thousands? Starmer pivoted to the fiscal inheritance and the £22 billion black hole. The inherited deficit excuse was wearing thin. People weren't stupid. They understood that if there was a fiscal crisis, everyone should share the burden. But that wasn't happening. MPs kept their expenses, public sector workers got pay rises, and pensioners lost their heating support. It looked like a choice about who mattered and who didn't, and pensioners had been deemed expendable. Behind the scenes, Labour strategists were panicking. Internal polling showed the winter fuel payment issue was driving voters away in key demographics. Older voters, traditionally Labour-leaning in many northern constituencies, were furious. Their adult children, worried about their parents freezing over winter, were also turning against the government. Even younger voters, no natural friends of means-tested benefits for pensioners, thought the hypocrisy of MPs claiming expenses while cutting support was outrageous. Morgan McSweeney, Starmer's chief strategist, held crisis meetings with cabinet members. "We're losing this," he said bluntly. "Every day this stays in the news, we lose more support. We need to either change the policy or change the narrative." But changing the policy meant admitting error and looking weak. Starmer's entire political identity was built on being the serious, competent alternative to conservative chaos. A major U-turn would undermine that. So they chose to change the narrative instead. The new line was that Labour was making tough but necessary choices, and that critics wanted to return to unfunded spending promises that would crash the economy. It was focus-grouped messaging that might have worked in normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, because every time a minister said tough choices, journalists asked why those choices always seemed to affect the poor and the old while sparing the politicians. Pressure groups and charities intensified their campaigns. Age UK launched a petition calling for the cuts to be reversed. It gathered over 750,000 signatures. Independent Age published case studies of pensioners facing impossible choices between heating and eating. Help the Aged organised protests outside Parliament. Even traditionally non-political organisations, like the Royal Voluntary Service, spoke out about their concerns. But the government held firm. Reeves gave a speech to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool defending her decision. "I know this has been controversial," she said. "I know some people are angry, but I make no apologies for fixing the public finances and targeting support to those who need it most." The conference delegates gave her polite applause, but it was nothing like the ovation previous chancellors had received. Labour members were divided. The old left wing despised the cuts as Tory-light austerity. The newer members thought it was politically suicidal. Only the most loyal Blairites defended it as tough-minded realism. And then, in early October, the first winter death was reported. An 81-year-old woman in Newcastle, living alone, had been found dead in her flat. The heating hadn't been on. The coroner would later determine she'd died from hypothermia. Her name was Dorothy Wilson. She'd been a Labour voter all her life. She'd lost her winter fuel payment under the new rules because her income was £47 per week above the pension credit threshold. Her family gave interviews to the media. They were grief-stricken and furious. "My mother died because Rachel Reeves decided her heating didn't matter," her son said. "She was too proud to ask for help. She tried to make do without heating to save money. And it killed her. This government has blood on its hands." The government issued a statement, expressing sympathy, but insisting there was no direct link between the policy and Mrs. Wilson's death. That technicality fooled nobody. Everyone understood the chain of causation. The policy created financial pressure. The pressure led to reduced heating. Reduced heating in an elderly person with health conditions proved fatal. The blood was metaphorical but real. Dorothy Wilson became a symbol. Her photo appeared in newspapers alongside the headline, "Died because ministers kept their expenses." Vigils were held. MPs' offices received death threats. The political temperature became dangerous. And still, the government wouldn't reverse the policy, because reversing it would mean admitting they'd been wrong. And modern politics doesn't allow for that kind of honesty. By November, with winter truly arriving, the scale of the crisis was becoming apparent. Citizens' Advice reported a 34% increase in people seeking help with energy bills. Food banks reported pensioners skipping meals to afford heating. NHS emergency departments saw increased admissions for cold-related illnesses among the elderly. But there was another story developing in parallel. Pensioners were fighting back, not with violence or protests, but with quiet dignity and devastating moral force. Across the country, elderly people started posting their energy bills on social media next to screenshots of MPs' expense claims. The hashtag #Churn, who deserves sheeting trended for days. The posts were simple and powerful. An 85-year-old's £140 monthly heating bill next to Rachel Reeves' £1,044 annual expenses claim. A 79-year-old's choice between heating and groceries next to a photo of MPs cheering in Parliament. The cumulative effect was crushing for the government. And then came the moment that changed everything. On 15 November, during a particularly cold snap, Rachel Reeves gave an interview on BBC Breakfast. The interviewer, Sally Nugent, asked about reports of pensioners struggling with bills. Reeves gave her standard answer about pension credit and targeting support. Nugent interrupted. "Chancellor, you've claimed £3,700 in heating expenses over 5 years. Do you think it's right that you have taxpayer-funded heating while pensioners like Dorothy Wilson died because they couldn't afford theirs?" Reeves's response was a disaster. "I think that's an unfair characterization. MPs' expenses are legitimate costs associated with doing the job, and I would say to any pensioner struggling that they should apply for pension credit, if eligible." Nugent persisted. "But you earn over £150,000. Why do you need taxpayers to fund your heating?" Reeves became defensive. "I earn that because of the responsibility I carry, and expenses are set independently. I didn't make those rules, but you could choose not to claim them, couldn't you? As a gesture of solidarity with the pensioners who've lost support because of your decision." The pause was fatal. Reeves clearly hadn't prepared for that question. When she answered, her tone was cold. "I don't think grandstanding gestures help anyone. What helps is responsible fiscal policy." The interview went viral within minutes. "I don't think grandstanding gestures help anyone" became the quote that defined Reeves's approach. To her, giving up expense claims would be grandstanding. To everyone else, taking money from pensioners while keeping your own heating paid for was something much worse. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Even Labour-supporting commentators struggled to defend her. "Rachel Reeves just lost the moral argument," was one Guardian headline. "Chancellor's empathy failure dooms winter fuel cuts," analysed The Times. Within Labour, whispers began about whether Reeves should be moved. The problem was, she couldn't be. Firing her would be an admission that the policy was wrong. Keeping her meant absorbing continued damage. Either way, the government was trapped. By December, the political cost was becoming existential. Labour's poll numbers showed them neck and neck with Reform UK, with some polls putting Nigel Farage's party ahead. The winter fuel payment issue, combined with other missteps, had destroyed Labour's post-election honeymoon in record time. Starmer's personal ratings were catastrophic. His net approval was -44, lower than any prime minister at this stage of their term in modern history. And Rachel Reeves' ratings were even worse, -48, making her the least popular chancellor since records began. The government tried various moves to regain control. They announced a pension credit awareness drive to increase uptake. They promised to bring forward housing benefit reforms. They launched a task force to improve home insulation for the elderly, but none of it addressed the fundamental injustice. MPs still had their expenses, pensioners still didn't have their winter fuel payments, and the death toll kept rising. By January 2025, Age UK estimated that excess winter deaths among the elderly had increased by 11% compared to the previous year. The charity directly attributed this to reduced heating in homes where winter fuel payments had been cut. The government disputed the methodology, but couldn't dispute the basic truth. More pensioners were dying, and it was happening after heating support had been removed. The pressure finally broke the government in June 20. After months of devastating headlines, collapsing polls, and mounting evidence of harm, Rachel Reeves announced a U-turn. In a statement to Parliament, she said the government had listened to concerns and would restore winter fuel payments to all pensioners from winter 2025. But there was a catch. The payment would be clawed back through the tax system from pensioners with incomes over £35,000. This meant everyone would receive it initially, but higher income pensioners would repay it via pay or self-assessment. It was a convoluted compromise that satisfied nobody and saved very little money. Critics called it the worst of both worlds. All the administrative complexity of means testing, plus most of the cost of universal provision. The government claimed victory, saying they'd listened and responded, but everyone else saw it for what it was, a humiliating retreat from an indefensible position. And the damage was done. The 8 months between cutting winter fuel payments and restoring them had destroyed Labour's reputation for competence and compassion. The expenses issue remained unresolved. MPs still claimed heating costs. Rachel Reeves still claimed 1,044 tiles per year. No minister voluntarily gave up their expenses in solidarity with pensioners. The message was clear. The rules didn't apply to them, the same way they applied to everyone else. Today, political analysts study the winter fuel payment crisis as a case study in political failure. It had everything: bad policy design, terrible timing, catastrophic communication, and hypocrisy that anyone could understand. But most of all, it had a fundamental misunderstanding of basic fairness. Rachel Reeves thought she could take heating support from pensioners while keeping her own taxpayer-funded heating, because the rules allowed it. Technically, she was right. The expenses were legitimate. The policy change was legal. Everything was within the formal bounds of acceptable behavior. But politics isn't just about rules. It's about perception, fairness, and whether people believe you're on their side. And when you heat your second home at public expense while telling pensioners they can't afford to heat their only home, you've lost that battle before it begins. The 8 seconds it took Rachel Reeves to press the voting button revealed something fundamental about modern British politics: that the system protects those inside it while making those outside it pay. MPs get second homes, expenses, subsidized restaurants, and protected pensioners get means-tested benefits, cold homes, and lectures about fiscal responsibility. It's not sustainable. And it's not right. Subscribe to the channel if you want to know how political hypocrisy destroys trust. Because what you've just witnessed isn't just about winter fuel payments or heating expenses. It's about a political class that has forgotten who it exists to serve. It's about a government that chose to protect its own privileges while cutting support for the vulnerable. And it's about the moment when millions of people realized that their leaders didn't care about them nearly as much as they cared about themselves. Rachel Reeves may have reversed the policy, but she can never undo the damage. Every time she claims heating expenses, people will remember. Every time the government lectures about tough choices, people will ask why those choices never seem to affect the politician. Every time Labour talks about representing working people, voters will think about Dorothy Wilson, who died cold and alone, while the Chancellor kept her second home warm at public expense. That's the legacy of those 8 seconds. Not just a failed policy, but a complete collapse of moral authority. And in politics, once you lose that, you very rarely get it back.